Welcome everyone to the Gilder Center regular lunchtime series. My name is Ed Rugemer. I'm a professor of history and Black studies here at Yale. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Emily Greble is Nelson O. Tyrone Jr. Chair of History at Vanderbilt University, where she also serves as chair of the department.
Not right now.
Although not right now, but unfortunately soon. She is a historian of the Balkans and Eastern Europe, with research interest in law and society, the role of Islam within Europe, and civil conflict. Her first book explored the city of Sarajevo under Nazi occupation, and her second book explored how Muslim men, women, and children shaped the states and societies of modern Europe from the 1880s to the 1940s. And the second book won numerous prizes. She's here at Yale to work on her third project on the devolution of slavery in Ottoman Europe during the 19th century. Slavery had deep roots in Eastern Europe, going back to at least the medieval period, probably earlier. Yet in contrast to the extensive literature on the end of slavery in the Americas, from the US through the Caribbean to Spanish America and Brazil, the historical question about the end of slavery in Europe has barely been considered, and Emily is taking that on with this project. I look forward to hearing that.
Great, thank you so much. And I just want to thank you all in the room and on the Zoom for being here. As Ed said, this is a new research project for me, and this is the first time I'm presenting any part of it. And so I really look forward to your honest critique and feedback and your thoughts. Great. So I adapted the title a little bit because I received some emails in advance where people thought I was going to talk about medieval Europe. And I realized that was a little confusing. And so I changed it to focus because I'm dealing with 19th century Europe. So I'm going to just jump right in with an anecdote. In 1825, Ekaterina, who was a Christian widow from the Greek Macedonian town, so she was from the Greek Macedonian town of Naousa. She traveled to a different town called Niš, which was in the Ottoman province of Rumelia, which is today Serbia, to try to raise ransom money to free her 3 daughters from slavery. During the Greek rebellion in 1821, Ekaterina's husband had been killed and her 4 children had been enslaved by the Ottomans as punishment. The 3 daughters had been taken here to Monastir, also known as Bitola, where they were enslaved together by a wealthy Ottoman official, a very famous man, Hasan Pasha. Now, Ekaterina's son was 4 years old at the time he was enslaved, and he was taken elsewhere. Now, enslaving the family members of Ottoman Christian rebels had become common practice in the early decades of the 19th century. In earlier times, enslavement of war captives had largely excluded Ottoman subjects. But starting in the late 18th century, as numerous uprisings and rebellions were sort of rattling the European provinces of the empire, Ottoman lawyers and the Sheikhul Islam, the highest ranking legal scholar in the empire, reinterpreted Islamic law to legitimize the enslavement of rebels and their families, even if they were Ottoman subjects. And historian Will Smiley has detailed this in both the legal genealogy and the ramifications in his really extraordinary book. Now, redemption or ransoming of Christian slaves was common practice in the region at the time. Sometimes it was done legally, often it was done illegally. So Ekaterina went to the local Orthodox bishop in Niš, this city in Ottoman Serbia, on the edge of Ottoman Serbia, to receive permission to beg among the city's Christians. While walking along the city streets, she suddenly saw her son. He was about 8 years old. Now, it's unclear to me if she had a hunch her son was in Niš or if this is a total chance encounter. The journey from Naousa or from Monastir was a particularly long one. It would have been multi days. I just found a note in the archive that suggested it was at least 24 hours for a journey half that distance at this time. So she took this incredibly long journey. It was also a really difficult one. There were insurgencies and bandits operating throughout these territories. This is the time of the Greek Revolution, and that expanded across all of Ottoman Europe. It's also the roads themselves are in pretty poor shape. There was regular flooding that prevented passage. Oftentimes you have caravans that had to stay overnight for multiple days in one place because they couldn't move along the roads. So it's possible that Ekaterina was traveling around the region, visiting lots of different bishoprics, trying to raise money to ransom her daughters. It's possible. I think so. Okay. It's possible that she tried to get close to Ottoman Serbia, which had recently been named an autonomous province. I'll come back to that in a moment, and thought that her position kind of on the border of Serbia would give her more leverage. And it's also possible that she was a KG mother who had learned through the rumor mill that her kid was in Niš and was going to figure out where he was. So in her own account, Ekaterina presents seeing her son as totally serendipitous. She's just walking down the street when suddenly she saw her son. She burst into tears, blurting out, "That is my own only son." His merciless master, as she describes the Muslim man accompanying him, informed Ekaterina that he had taken the child for his own, essentially adopted him. The master then called a local goldsmith from the Niš Christian community to attest to this fact, that the goldsmith did. The mother was dismissed. So in the legal and social context of this time, the child was no longer legally her son. He is a Muslim child of a Muslim father. So we learn of this tragic story in a petition that Ekaterina sends to the Prince Miloš of Serbia, in this sort of circled area up here, in which she's asking him for money to help ransom her daughters. Right, now Miloš is a pretty cagey Ottoman operative who was negotiating a very complex, legally pluralistic world. Following a series of rebellions between 1806 and 1815, and the mass enslavement and massacres of more than 10,000 Christians in his province, Miloš had negotiated with the Sultan to receive autonomy. He became a hereditary prince, essentially the sovereign of Christians in this territory, and he had a responsibility over a wide assortment of issues and Christian affairs. The system is known as legal autonomy. It's different from the system of vassalage, which existed in the early modern period, and it's documented by another awesome new book that's coming out this June by Amy Janelle called Empire by Law. So Miloš is known to be pretty sympathetic to enslaved Christians and also to people trying to petition to raise money for them. He was frustrated that so many of his own people had been killed and enslaved during previous uprisings, and he was pretty committed to making sure that wouldn't happen again, which would subsequently lead to all sorts of negotiations with the Ottomans. But he was also, by many accounts, a slave owner himself. On several occasions, he ransomed fugitive slaves and took them into his own home, no doubt as concubines, servants, and other forms of unfree labor. So there's a real slipperiness that goes on in the terminology between buying and selling people within a legal framework of slavery and purchasing or redeeming people, ransoming people in this alternative framework of Christian redemption and ransom. So Ekaterina informs Prince Miloš that she had raised enough funds to free 2 of her daughters, but she needed 3,500 groschen to buy back the third. This is a lot of money for the time, roughly the equivalent of an annual income for a low-skilled worker in the region. And time was of the essence because she had learned that the girl was about to be gifted to her owner's nephew, perhaps that she was coming of age, and that this would then come with being absorbed into a new household, again, potentially as a servant or a concubine, a position that could be very difficult, if not impossible, to extract her from. So her moving description of seeing her son is included largely for emotional appeal. She wants to play on the sympathy of the prince so that she can get more money. She kissed his hand, standard language for petitions, and connected her fate to the broader plight of Christians in the regions, describing how the lawless and merciless Turks, that's a quote, had, quote, taken so many hundreds of innocent souls who fell under the insatiable sword of the tyrants and were sent to slavery and taken away. So these orientalist phrases are slipping off the tongues of Europeans in the 1820s at the time, and they were used to great effect by revolutionaries, abolitionists, and nationalists. I'm going to come back to that also. So in a bid to evoke this sort of sense of Christian charity and get the prince to give her more money, she then connects the plight of her lost child, saying that she gives her son for prosperity to the Orthodox Christian people. All right, so essentially, her son is lost, but there's still hope, and he can sort of save Christianity. So the formulaic language of this petition suggests that Ekaterina understood how such petitions should be crafted, or rather, whoever the scribe was, or official who was assisting her, understood the formula. It is doubtful to me that she spoke or understood Serbian. The woman from Greek Macedonia, so she most likely spoke Greek, some combination of Ottoman Turkish, potentially a Proto-Bulgarian based on where she was. This is an era before South Slavic language reform, before schools are actively teaching a standardized form of Serbian, which has been really fun for me with these documents. Less than 10% of the population was really literate at all. So I bring up this story because I think it reveals to us a particular moment in this history of slavery. She knows that where her son lived, she knows who took him. The local Christian merchants know this, the Serbian prince knows this. The child lives in plain sight, adopted, absorbed into the fabric of a different urban society. He is a slave-turned-son, which is a common phrase in the literature. Everyone understood there was no reversal of a conversion. There's no means of repatriation to a Christian subjecthood. There's no sense of a family having any kind of household rights that would supersede the owner. The son at this point can serve as nothing more than a way to try to raise money to free his sister so she does not end up in a similar state of no return. So Ekaterina's story is interesting, I think, to sort of open up this question of 19th century Ottoman European slavery for a couple of reasons. First, it's one of the only sources I've found in my research so far on Ottoman Serbia that's written in the voice of a woman who's embroiled in this complex system of slavery. The document is located in the archive of the Serbian regional government in Kragujevac, where Prince Miloš lived. I'm a Balkan historian. I work with South Slavic sources, and this is one of about 100 documents I've found so far mentioning slavery among several thousand documents I've collected from 10 different Serbian district and court archives from the 1820s to the 1840s. I also wanted to begin with Ekaterina's story because I think it hints at some of the many themes that are going to be at play in 19th century Ottoman European slavery. Conversion, adoption, kidnapping, concubinage. It deals with ransom and redemption. And it also shows the involvement of church officials, Christian officials, Ottoman imperial bureaucrats, and enslaved and free Christians living in an entwined world. Thirdly, Ekaterina's story helps us unravel some of the complexities of doing research on 19th century Ottoman European slavery. Right? If we wanted to try to piece together just this one family's story, we'd need to look in Ottoman imperial archives in Istanbul, political and legal archives in Niš, Bitola, Athens, Salonika, Belgrade, Kadi court records or sigil in Bitola, Orthodox church archives, and perhaps archives belonging to the Christian Guild as well. All of these institutions maintained records in their own ways according to their own institutional priorities with their own language traditions. So we have Ottoman Turkish, Greek, Serbian, Bulgarian, Old Church Slavonic, Arabic, and French. Foreign consular and diplomatic archives emerged as another center of documentation for this experience. So that would add English, French, German, Russian, and Italian to our sort of language template. And multiple archives are all existing in the same places and documenting different parts of a story. So, you know, her travels are documented through perhaps a bishopric and the princes, but her daughter's manumission would have been documented in a sigil in monastir. So in other words, to track down this one family's history, we need to work in at least 5 countries in as many as 10 languages in what would easily add up to 24 archives. Now we amplify that by all of the tens of thousands of enslaved people, and you can see why this particular subject has not been well mined. We also have the problem of, like the fragmented archives, we have to confront a fragmented historiography that has emerged because of the ways that modern political boundaries and modern historiographies have developed. So this particular story would belong to Turkish history, as sort of a successor of Ottoman history. It would belong to Greek history. It would belong to the history of North Macedonia. It would belong to the history of Serbia. All of these histories ask different questions, they follow different threads, they have different presumptions, they have different biases, both within the region by scholars working on it and also outside of it. Then there's the fact that Ekaterina's story and the enslavement of Christian women and children was just one tiny part of a much more expansive history of enslavement across the entire Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. At an imperial level, there's a small but rich literature on this subject, although the Balkans are typically sort of in a marginal place of it. Here's a couple of studies that look at 19th century slavery in the Ottoman Empire. The last is a picture of Ceyda Karim-Mursel, who has not yet published a book, but has written some phenomenal articles on the topic. Within the Balkans, we have multiple overlapping coexisting systems of slavery, each of which had their own laws, norms, and customary presumptions. This includes agricultural slavery, household slavery, the enslavement of military deserters and war captives, the enslavement of rebels, and the wholesale migration of slave societies from the North Caucasus to the Balkans in the 1850s and 60s, which just was analyzed by another awesome book, Empire of Refugees by Vladimir Hamed-Trojansky. Then in addition to the tens of thousands of Christian rebels and these migrating slave communities, we also have the racialized slavery of over 200,000 Roma on monastic and Christian princely lands in the Ottoman provinces of Wallachia and Moldova, which has been analyzed by scholars like Viorel Panete, Magda Metache, and Manuel Boacha and Anca Pavlescu. There are also enslaved Tatars, Circassians, enslaved Africans and Arabs, right? There are war captives from both the Austrian and Russian armies that filter through the stories. You can find them in sort of people's homes in Bosnia or in what is today Kosovo. All right, so you get the sense this is a really complicated, entwined story. There's also local customs of kidnapping and bride theft that crossed community lines and were not considered part of the formal story of slavery, but I'm going to suggest probably should be, because there was widespread acceptance of buying, selling, and stealing women. Who were not understood as legal subjects in their own right, but as property. So this brings me to the last point I want to leave us with Ekaterina's story, which is that the scant details of her life through this petition reveal these multiple encounters with patriarchal power. We have the wealthy Ottoman owner of her daughters, the Orthodox bishop, the goldsmith, the Christian prince. She, as a woman, a foreigner, a widow, a dead rebel's wife, is trying to navigate all of these conflicting patriarchies to find and free her children. She had no legal subjecthood on her own. She belonged to whatever system she was being taken by. And it was only through the bill of sale or a ransom payment, a formal process that one could be moved from one system to the other. But she learns to use these tools of patriarchy, of the master, of the hegemon, and she tries to operate within it. She learns the rules and she tries to speak the language of power. So this is a new project for me. Oh, these are some photos of the Balkans at the time. I'll leave us with this. And I came to this project, as Ed was saying at the beginning, by wanting to understand what happened when slavery ended in the Balkans. I am largely a 20th century Balkan historian. And I started with a simple puzzle. Slavery existed in the Ottoman Empire. Lots of countries emerge out of the Ottoman Empire. What happens to the slaves? What happens to the systems of slavery when this imperial structure is no longer there? Right? And that includes places like Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Montenegro, and also Bosnia and Herzegovina, which Austria-Hungary occupies in 1878 and then annexes it. So where do the slaves go? What happens to them? And I came at this question with an understanding that slavery was really important to all of the countries that came out and after the Ottoman Empire. In every Balkan country to emerge, slavery was a dominant trope for describing the experience of Ottoman history. We have people all the time, like all of the major national writers and lyrical poets, are discussing the tormented slaves, the tormented Christian slaves, ruges, mučeno, the enslavement of the Christian spirit. There's a Catholic priest and writer from Bosnia, Ivan Franjo Jukic, who kept publishing stories about the region's enslaved and subjugated population, Peruviani or Robovi Christiana. I have tons of these examples where they're all saying we have to emancipate our Christian nations from the Ottomans. At the same time, the enslavement of Christians in the Balkans during the 1820s and 30s was a huge source of international outrage. Artists painted it, poets such as Lord Byron in the Isles of Greece and Thomas Campbell in Song of the Greeks penned verses that highlighted the plight of slaves in Greece. British, German, Scottish, Americans, French, Russians all drew on this imagery of Ottoman slavery as evidence of Ottoman tyranny and barbarism, the absence of civilization, which they would then use to justify or support sort of intervention in these areas. The racial undertones of their outrage cannot be understated. There was never outrage expressed about enslaved Arabs, Africans, or Roma. This was very much a story of these white Christian women who clearly should not be enslaved by nature of their Europeanness and their Christianity and their whiteness. So given this sort of international outrage over the enslavement of these Christians, and given that slavery was, became so important in the national stories of all the Balkan states, one would think that there would be lots of sources and documents about it. Instead, what I found were total silence. Across both the Balkan historiography, the published literature on it, and also most of the South Slavic sources, as well as those in translation from Ottoman, there's hardly anything. There was a single article written in the Serbian language in the 1950s, and then nothing until the 2020s. There's a scattering of documents in archives that are typically part of jurisdictional disputes. So, in a 500 or 800 page kind of collection of manuscripts, I might find one or two references. One was to an owner who has one slave who leaves. She's a grandmother and she leaves her daughter and grandchildren and they're trying to work out the jurisdiction, right? Who has control? I've combed through travelogues, letters, and memoirs of people who were documenting this everyday life, both foreigners and also the very same nationalists who were talking excessively about this enslavement. And there's never a discussion of enslavement. There's never a critique. Instead, we find a passing reference to a slave handing someone a pipe or a cup of tea. We find a brief mention of seeing a wretched slave on the street. There's one French traveler who describes receiving 5 female slaves, some cows and sheep as a gift, and then moves on. Olga Todorova, who has not written this in English, but I include her here anyway because I think it's a really powerful book, is a prominent scholar of slavery in Bulgaria. And she's argued that Bulgarians fused a metaphorical idea of enslavement of the Bulgarian people with the real condition of slavery that existed. And she argues that Bulgarians came to understand slavery as something that happened to other people, which allowed them to sort of amplify the metaphorical and erase the real experience. even when Bulgarians continued to be enslaved in the 1870s through the rebellions, they were not discussed in terms of the real slaves, but instead in front of this sort of metaphor. So why is slavery missing? There's this radical disconnect between this trope of slavery on the one hand and analysis of the specifics on the other. Slaves are background. And by the 1840s and 50s, they simply disappear from all of the sources, even in areas that remain part of the Ottoman Empire, but are in southeastern Europe, such as Bosnia and the Sanjak of Novi Pazar. So where do they go? This is what I've been trying to sort of wrestle with. What happens to them? Are they simply absorbed? Do they convert? Are they abandoned? Do they die off? Did women who had nowhere to go become prostitutes? I have some hunches, nothing concrete, and this part of my larger research proceeds very, very slowly. So instead, what I've been trying to wrap my head around is, can we figure out why slavery is missing from this narrative? And will the answer to that question help us make sense of what might have happened? So in other words, can we figure out the afterlives of slavery by figuring out why nobody wanted to talk about it? And that's what I just want to finish with in the next few minutes. So I've come up with two sort of explanations of why slavery goes missing, right? The first is that these were slave societies. And I've read a ton and I've been learning so much from the scholarship on the Americas about this. Slavery was part of a broader regional system. It was ever present and it was interconnected to economies and politics. Christians, Muslims, and Jews across the Balkans were all complicit in it. In Serbia, Prince Miloš and Serbian nobles kept slaves, even as they allowed for the raising of ransom and redemption of other slaves. Miloš's government was responsible for providing security and transport for any harem moving through his region, which meant protecting and making sure slaves did not run away. The historian Miloš Jovanović, in a book that's just coming out called Cities of Dust and Mud, uncovered that in the urban development of Belgrade, the Miloš government sought to build a port to participate in the Romanian Romani slave trade. A public slave market exists in Belgrade as late as 1840, as the picture of the Istanbul one, which existed till 1847. Now in Belgrade, this was considered to be on the Ottoman side of town, but it was there, it's in Belgrade. Slaves are on the move, they're living in the same towns and villages and places where free Christians lived. They're not cordoned off in some Ottoman world. When a fugitive slave woman escaped in the town of Vidin, which is today in Bulgaria, her owner agreed to sell her children to a Christian with whom she was hiding out. So we have Christians constantly engaged in this dynamic. Then there's the Orthodox monasteries that I mentioned earlier, right? And Christian princes, let's go back to the Orthodox monasteries, which own hundreds of thousands of slaves. And historian Viorel Panete has argued that while the literature has emphasized the enslavement of Roma in Romania, it is quite likely that similar systems at different points existed also in Serbia, Bulgaria, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And then let's not forget Greece, the poster child of emancipation, the national revolution. Greece wins its independence in 1830, but the slave trade continues. The Methodist newspaper Watchman publishes this sort of scathing rebuke in 1840 of King Otto, who, quote, was fully aware of the slave trade for 2 years and remains deaf to the remonstrances of his ministers. He positively will not do anything to put a stop to it or allow the law to be carried into effect against the offenders. All right. So what we find is that it's easy to complain about Ottoman tyranny. It's easy to use the trope of slavery, but actually to kind of address it would mean thinking about the implications of undoing it. It would mean severing ties to broader regional networks, political networks, economic networks, taking apart certain forms of patriarchal power, and confronting their own kind of complicity of a variety of Christian institutions and individuals who are part of this system. None of these places wanted to do that in the 1840s and 50s, and most of their contemporaries don't want, the historians and scholars don't really want to do it in the 2000s. So a second explanation for why we have these silences around slavery and its afterlives in Ottoman Europe is a little more complicated. And it involves the ways that local and imperial patriarchies operated and how household and village authority was constituted. It also involves the fact that the majority of at least the enslaved Christians are women who had no legal subjecthood in their own right. So we end up with all sorts of issues of shame, honor, and sort of the question of what happens to these women. If they're formally manumitted, it could be awkward. Had they been raped, prostituted, impregnated? Did their children convert? Did they convert? What happened to former husbands? If someone was enslaved but their spouse was not, could they get remarried? And then what happened if they returned? Who paid for them? Who was responsible for them? These are not places that had widespread social structures. These are most of the institutional support was sort of locally based systems of villages, village elders, and religious organizations. So we get a really interesting case in 1822 that sort of brings this to the fore. There's an enslaved Christian woman who had been born in Ottoman Serbia. Her name is Angelia, and she's taken with her two daughters, Joka and Gospova, during the 1813 rebellion. Trying to see if I can hurry. And she's taken to Ottoman Bosnia, which is right next door to Ottoman Serbia, as the property of a wealthy landowner in the town of Banja Luka. And in 1822, he decides to manumit the women. But they really have nowhere to go. So we have this case where a Bosnian Ottoman administrator writes to the administrators in Belgrade, which is overseeing Serbian Christians, to see if they can try to find some kind of familial connection for these women who would take them in from this beg or landowner who wanted to manumit them. But barring that, and the report includes no mention of any kind of resolution, the women could not easily return home. They might be free in an Ottoman legal context, but that freedom doesn't come with any right to belong somewhere else. So manumission becomes extremely logistically complicated. Angelia's legal and physical reintegration into Serbian society, what we might think of today as repatriation or the right of return, requires a number of concrete steps. First, she needs to have the documentation and the accompaniment of someone who will physically transport her. This involves getting a tezkere, an Ottoman travel document, which was hugely complicated because there were an overabundance of, there was a shortage of scribes and an inundation of requests on the border in the region. It's not actually clear to me that a woman could have or get a tezkere without being accompanied by an owner or head of household. If anyone knows, I've been eagerly trying to figure this out. So she'd need to have some kind of extended family who's willing to come all the way, again, I mean, multiple days of travel to claim her and bring her back. Then there's the question that villages don't always want and households don't always want these women back. The historian of Caribbean slavery, Adriana Kira, eloquently describes how these processes of manumission involved a careful resolution and negotiation between local communities. And that it was contextualized, localized, variable, built out of the scraps of subjective judgments of community members, not a form of individual autonomy. It's a quote. So the Serbian prince and Christians in Serbia, Christian men, might theoretically like the idea of throwing some money at helping women get out of enslavement, but then what, right? Who takes care of them? Where did they go? And who's going to be responsible? There's cases like a woman named Jovanka Cholakovic from Serbia, who was manumitted without her children, goes home to Serbia, finds her husband's married to someone else. What does she do? In that moment, Prince Miloš was asked to adjudicate, and there were a number of cases that were similar, and he would try to come up with different solutions that included things like having husbands return dowries in order to sever the marital ties, or unofficially sanction polygamous marriage. So you also have cases of husbands now, Christian husbands having multiple wives. I find this return of dowries and the transactional aspect of trading enslaved women particularly interesting. Because women were not considered by their local communities or households to be people, but rather to be property. They could be beaten, they could be killed with little consequence. They were legally considered the same as minor children. They could not be heads of household. And as I mentioned earlier, there was this widespread practice of kidnapping women for sort of and forcing them into marriage, something called utmica. And so if there's no citizenry and no national belonging for these women in their own right, what would manumission even mean, right? So where would they go? Relatedly, would a woman want to go home, right? Here we have a case of another enslaved woman, Stevana, who was taken in 1813, again from Ottoman Serbia, and she was sent with her young son to the Grand Vizier's harem in Istanbul. Her son was eventually appointed the Sultan's muhardar, a private secretary. Such an appointment would suggest he had converted to Islam. Stevana remained enslaved and Christian. 20 years later, she sends word back to Serbia to try to see if she can track down some family members through a German messenger. Now, the source is entirely silent on what she's trying to find in particular and whether or not she wanted to go home. But it raises this important question of she's clearly trying to gain information. But what would attract her to going back, and what would she find there? In many ways, the enslaved mother of a prominent Muslim official would have had a significantly better life in enslavement in Istanbul than as an impoverished Christian peasant woman in a rural village. She'd live in a nice home, something of a servant, perhaps something of a grandmother, with access to food, goods, and comforts her own parents would never have dreamed of. And in many ways, the experience of her legal place as a slave in Istanbul would not be that different from her freedom in a Christian village. In both cases, she'd have no rights as an individual, but would be treated as property of the head of household, one called an owner, the other called a husband. So, by way of conclusion, I'd like us to leave us with this. I think if we can figure out the structural reasons for the silences around questions of slavery in 19th century Ottoman Europe, and if scholars can try to collaborate to piece together the various fragments from different linguistic, archival, and historiographical perspectives, I'm hopeful we can try to develop a better understanding of both how these diverse systems of slavery worked and also how they came undone. I believe that this will have important implications for understanding questions of women's citizenship, repatriation and the right of return, and also ideas of statelessness in modern states. Now, as a Balkan historian who is new to the field of slavery, part of what's been so exciting to me about this fellowship and about joining this community is trying to think through some of these bigger problems and silences among a community that has been grappling with this comparatively across different times and different places. And I really look forward to your honest critique and feedback and suggestions. I've put forward 2 possibilities for these silences, but no doubt the people in these spaces have others to throw out there, and I would really welcome those ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions from the room to begin with? Amber? Go ahead.
Thanks so much. This is really a fascinating project. I'm looking forward to seeing where you take it. I have lots of questions, but I wanted to start by pushing you to think about comparisons a bit later. And the thing that this really brings to mind for me is the campaigns after the Armenian genocide that were spearheaded by any number of organizations of precisely the kind that were accessing the same kinds of tropes about, you know, the enslavement of civilized Christians by barbaric Muslims, right, is something that comes up in that context as well. But in that case, after the war, there was this enormous effort on the part of mission societies, kind of, you know, Philo-Armenian groups in places like England and France, to identify Armenian children and women who had been absorbed into Muslim families and remove them, right? This also involves this kind of incredibly intensive attempt at documentation, undertaken, you know, in considerable tension with the emerging Turkish state. So I was just wondering, I mean, it's another kind of contrast in some ways where I was wondering if you have thoughts about why that emerges then, and we don't seem to have these campaigns by similar groups with similar kinds of interests and similar rhetoric engaged in the task of kind of extricating people from situations of slavery on the grounds that they are Christians and belong to civilized Western Europe in some way. I'm just curious whether that comes up, whether that ever happens, whether, you know, if we can identify a moment where that does start to happen.
Yeah, so in the same time period after World War I, I was just in the divinity school archive, and I found that there's all these reports where they're sending you know, missionaries and various humanitarian organizations to Serbia, and they're trying to like develop orphanages and also schools for women, and they talk about how there's all these kind of missing kids, but there's no sense in that. First of all, it's like there's no sense of any kind of references to enslavement, and I think that sort of by that point it's done, right? And I can't quite tell when it finishes exactly, and you know, it ends in some point in the 19th century, but there's clearly still no institutional structures for this. And so they're trying to sort of negotiate. It's not until the socialist period that women have any kind of formal legal subjecthood in most of this area. And so I've been hunting for these kinds of things about what happens to women. The reason I don't know why they don't address it at all in like the 50s and the 60s. And this is where, you know, I hate histories that are about the big gaps and the silences, because you're like, well, what happened, right? But I can't figure out what happens to all these women. And I mean, it could just be a question of really having to hunt through more documents and like keep collecting and reading. But there is no like legal conversation about any form of repatriation. There's little hints, like in the late 1830s, there's a case where some Serbian officials refer to a woman as a Serbian woman of ours, which implies that there might be this national sense of belonging emerging, but it's not connected to policy. And I think that part of this too is that like there's not really strong institutions, there's not a lot of strong state building. And there's still very kind of deeply localized authority, villages sort of mediating who can return, who can't. There isn't like a state understanding yet. There will be in the 1880s. And so when we think about like the quote I gave from Olga Todorova, you know, the fact is that there were additional people who were enslaved in the 1870s. And so we know that, right? But again, where did they go? And I don't yet know the answer to that. I imagine it would be politically very sensitive to start talking about, like in the Armenian case, of identifying Christians who are absorbed in Muslim households. I think it's very common with the children. I think it's probably common also with the women. And I think it would be kind of a national can of worms that would really like rattle national historiographies, especially if told by an American historian. So thank you though for the question.
Ed, may I pick up on that very point? First of all, we're all grateful for this. This is a fascinating topic, subject. And also, I really admire your sense of inconclusiveness, your willingness to say that. Why not? You just mentioned nations and nationalism at the very end there in your response. I don't know if this is the case. I don't know any of these sources, but is it possible that this amnesia, silence is yes, but this some kind of structured amnesia across this culture does grow with the beginnings of nationalism? That is, I mean, parts of this region, big parts of this region, all become part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and yet some are becoming nations. And well, the first things nations do is build histories and defend histories and so on. I don't know. Is that really worth a look? Because if there's the necessity of national memory, who wants to be a slave trading, slave holding country by the middle or late 19th century and even into the early 20th? So I don't know. I like your two conclusions. They seem entirely plausible, but what about this idea of nation making and therefore the memory problem?
Yeah, I think that actually ties directly, you're absolutely right, into kind of why in the time also people are they don't want to talk about it because they're both developing these national narratives and these national mythologies that are claiming, that they're the enslaved people. And so, if you're the enslaved, then you can't be the enslaver.
Yeah.
And I think that, it would be great if we had more church records. Not very publicly accessible, but also for the Orthodox churches to have been kind of complicit in these processes, and those become so central to the nations and connected to national mythologies. So yes, I think, and especially in the 20th century, as all of these places are developing more sort of hashing out complex historiographies, the Ottoman past is such a sort of controversial moment. It's just negative. So you have really interesting kind of younger generations of scholars now in places like Sofia and Belgrade who are learning Ottoman and trying to kind of push the boundaries on some of those presumptions. But it's politically really tough. And
yeah,
a lot of these it's hard to get funding. You can get ostracized.
Wow. Well, there's a serious memory problem here. One practical question: when's the last time a major conference was done on this or on Ottoman slavery? You showed us a half dozen books that are coming out. What should we be planning a major conference on Ottoman slavery with your help?
I mean, I think that would be great. I don't know of any. I mean, I don't know if you know of any. And I think it should include slavery and, as Laura said, the afterlives, because we know
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Bizarre, there were still slaves in 1908, 1913.
Sure.
And, so clearly this is something that's also affecting, right, modern Turkey and like what happens to, these systems and people. I have a panel.
Let's catch this wave.
But yeah, no, there's some really brilliant work going on, and it's not brought into conversation because of these fragmented, I think, historiographies. But it's exciting, and I think we all have a lot to learn about it from each other. And I also think it's a place where, the model of the individual scholar doesn't work, right? The individual historian and it really is going to depend on larger collaborations, big grant money.
We've done this before with, for example, Indian Ocean slavery and Indian Ocean slave trade. We did a big conference on that once, and it brought together a lot of the people doing it. We should talk, and we should think about this as a major conference.
I would love that. I mean, they're really, this research is so fantastic. I feel like when I want to put these people's pictures on PowerPoints because the work that has gone into each of these books to tell one's part of a story is really extraordinary.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, did you have any questions?
I have a ton of questions, but Well, I can go. So I take it none of these new states abolished slavery as a law in coming out of the Ottoman period. Is that the case?
So the Romanian state manumits all Romani slaves. They are the one place that has a formal manumission.
Mm-hmm.
All of the other states in their sort of early constitutional frameworks and state laws say they are states without slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And including
the paper law.
including Austria-Hungary, right? They don't have slaves. But there's no formal emancipation, right? There's no saying, and we are a state without slaves, and those people who are enslaved now are going to go to this institution, or we're going to have this. Like, that part of it is just, there's just nothing. So, yeah.
So that's
it's really
so
weird.
that's not really a starting point in a way.
I thought
It
that
can
was going to be my starting
Yeah,
point.
yeah. I mean, one of the things that struck me is, especially talking about these nationalist historiographies of the Balkans, and then this metaphor of slavery that they use, that they had been enslaved by the Ottomans. It's very similar to the rhetoric that American patriots will use during the Revolution, that the colonies had been enslaved by Great Britain, and they use that word.
Interesting.
Right? They use that slavery as a political metaphor. And that motivates, that motivates people to participate in the revolution and continue it, despite the fact that they held slaves. So you see this rhetoric used in Virginia and South Carolina, places where the enslaved population is quite significant. And while there are some who move from that moment, from that revolutionary movement to abolition, I mean, this happens in the northern states to an extent, but hardly uniform. It certainly doesn't happen in the South. And what emerges is a defense of slavery, is a pro-slavery once abolitionism as an idea emerges, and that's very different. Like, I use the term devolution in my introduction because it's not quite an abolition, right? I mean, in the Atlantic world, slavery has to be destroyed, right? It doesn't just disappear. It has to be actually destroyed, usually by war, by legislation, and enforcing that legislation, something like that, some dramatic political moment. And these are all slave societies as well, much like the Balkans. But slavery is never destroyed there. It's a big difference.
Yeah.
It's in the destruction of slavery where the archive is formed. In many ways, right?
Well, that's a good point. Yeah.
Well put.
Yeah.
Good.
I'm writing that down.
The emancipation gave us this massive archive.
Yeah, and the historiography.
Yeah.
As really the modern historiography on racial slavery really comes out of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. I mean, there had been like a romanticized historiography that slavery was this kind of benevolent institution before that. But this, that changes dramatically with the civil rights movement.
So that happens also with the Romani historiography. It's the sort of Roma civil rights movement that emerges over the last 20 or 30 years becomes directly connected then to research on and then the formal manumission of Roma slaves was public, and it was in the newspapers, and yet it was just not something people were not talking about hundreds of thousands of Roma in a form of racialized chattel slavery in Europe in the 1840s. Like, that whole narrative was just kind of missing, and so I think it did also get connected. And it's actually a number of the scholars who are doing it are also part of this sort of activist civil rights movement themselves.
Can I just add one thing to what you just said? Isn't it also a function of the commodification of people and the slave trade, both the international and domestic slave trades, through which an archive is formed as well?
Well, it is, because there's certainly
And so that's another difference. I think.
But I mean, you have a slave trade in the Balkans, I assume.
But it's not the same kind of commodification, is it? I mean, it's not.
There is an Ottoman archive that documents, but the sale, like the
Yeah.
actual sales, especially in the Ottoman, in the Istanbul slave
Mhm.
markets. There are bills of sale that have been unearthed, and they are not present in the individual Balkan archives in the same way.
Hmm.
And then wills and probate and all of that. I mean,
Right.
is that a source for you?
It is not a source for me because it was not dealing with kind of the people I was looking at. That it is a possibility that there would be more in those kinds of archives. There's just not a lot.
How many languages do you work in?
Comfortably, I work in the sort of South Slavic languages, so Serbian, and I'm working hard now in Old Serbian, which is kind of a hybrid of Old Church Slavonic and modern Serbian with some Russian and Turkisms thrown in. And Croatian, Bosnian, Montenegrin, these are all kind of languages that are in a related class. And then I read French and German, some Russian. But I don't work in Ottoman, and I'm not going to, because that's just a language I'm going to, that is just a bridge too far, and so I rely heavily on the Ottomanists,
Mhm.
and the work they're doing, and a lot of the conversations are, their sources say one thing and mine say something else, and trying to put those two things together is part of what's fun about this project. Leaning into.
Could we do such a conference in English, or would we need simultaneous translation?
No, you could absolutely do it in English.
Okay,
I mean,
okay.
all of the scholars that I put forward today, even Olga Todorova, work and speak and write in English. It's just not, her book is not yet. I think it should be translated.
Okay. Good to know.
Yes.
I was sort of coming back to this question of where a lot of this documentation is produced, and out of the kind of moments of emancipation. It seems that one other element of that, often by the imperial power, by like the state, is in its anxieties over what's to happen with all these newly emancipated or these manumitted people as well. I think this connects to your second explanation as well. Is part of this silence indicating a lack of crisis, right? There isn't I don't know, these archives often, to me, the imperial one seems like archives of anxieties over what are we going to do with all of these people? How are we going to manage all of this sort of like newly emancipated population? And so in this case, given, again, the sort of the status of women that you talked about is, I don't know, could we read a kind of lack of an anxiety over how they are to be, what kind of threat they might pose or issue, logistical even, they might pose to the new states afterwards? I'm trying to sort of think of, again, what that silence signifies, if it's a sort of disavow or kind of refusal to talk about something, but oftentimes I don't know, I find in the imperial archives in particular, there is a kind of over talking about these things because they form some kind of crisis.
That's a really good point. So, and it tells me something. So there is a sense of crisis, but the crisis, and this is in Serbia, but also in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So Serbia has a Christian majority that sort of becomes the political authorities. Bosnia-Herzegovina has a Muslim majority that becomes and is in tension with the Ottomans. So it's not just a Christian Ottoman story. It's really more of a like local versus imperial story. And what we find is an anxiety over jurisdiction. So in almost all of the local sources that I've found that mention slavery, it's not actually about the slave, it's about the jurisdictional question. So like, we have these 3 female slaves, one went missing, like who's responsible for finding her? Is it our police or their police? Right, we have, this harem, it's traveling with slaves, it got stuck in this place, who's responsible for, making sure that it doesn't get, kidnapped by bandits? Right, and so the question is less about the sort of anxieties over slavery, and I think it's more about the anxieties over the position of these autonomous provinces or non-autonomous provinces in their relationship with the empire. And if you start talking about, violating Ottoman slavery laws, now you're not going to be a partner in negotiating. Nobody, the Ottomans are not going to give you anything if you're like, we're going to buy, we don't believe in your laws anymore. And so I think that there is this kind of, it's not so much a refusal, but it's like we operate in a certain system. This is the overarching sovereign framework. And, we need to try to carve out our own jurisdictional autonomy. And within that, I will say, they're sort of obsessed with like the household as an operating unit. And right, a slave, a subaltern person, a minor child, right? They're within the household. So they're not, and this goes back to David's question, right? They're not yet part of the nation. They're not yet part of the Bulgarian nation or the Serbian nation, because they belong to a household and it's whatever your head of household is, right? And that system continues. I mean, I was just talking to my Swiss roommate about how until 1992, a Swiss woman, if she married a non-Swiss man, she lost her citizenship, right? She was, that is, so the system is not, we often think of these places in the peripheries of Europe as, this is a broad European modern state problem that persists through the 20th century.
We do have a lot of online questions.
Yeah.
So the first one, their name is Lois Macmillan. They actually zoomed in with their class.
Oh, wow.
High school class. They're from Oregon. The question was, if slavery disappeared, quote unquote, in places like Bosnia,
Herzegovina.
yeah, or Serbia or Romania, was it like the American South where the disappeared enslavement turned into slavery by another name?
It's a great question and welcome class. That's super exciting. I don't I don't think it persists as slavery in another name in the same way. I think what happened, well, that's not true. I think for the racialized enslavement of Roma, it does. I think that we see the sort of marginalization of Roma, who were also sort of historically also called gypsies, that population endures through a subjugated status in many places through today. And we see the structural kind of legacies of enslavement that persist from the formal manumission in terms of citizenship rights, property rights, rights of movement, all of these things, they continue. In terms of other forms of slavery, it's not entirely clear to me sort of where these structures go, right? And that's where I mentioned early on, I think there might be a sense of sort of women sort of being forced into sort of situations of prostitution, not really having anywhere to go. I'm really only finding decades later these kind of missionaries trying to create women's homes, but I haven't yet been able to connect them to specific people. It's just more that they exist. So I think this is, as Ed was saying, a very different situation than we have, in the Americas, both in terms of the sheer numbers are, different, and the kind of enslavements that we're talking about are different. And the fact that there is no kind of big crisis means that it's not being addressed openly. There's no violence associated with the end of this system. At one point, I don't think I brought this up, but in 1842, the British consular official to Belgrade sends this report where he's like, there's all these Arab and Black children being sold in like the Belgrade slave market, and the Austrians are kind of involved, and nobody seems to like be, caring about this. It just seems like this is normal. So I think, the racialized slavery becomes a different part of this story. And I was at a talk last year where someone mentioned that there was a Black slave in Greece in the 1890s that was sort of seen by a traveler. I was thinking, Greece was independent in 1830.
Yeah.
And there's an enslaved African person working on a farm. Like, are they still enslaved? Is this, as your question suggests, just slavery by a different name? I mean, is it an indentured servant issue? These are questions that I'm hoping, to keep teasing out.
The students were very much in awe with your presentation, and they asked, is there a way for us to get a copy of Katrina's narrative, or maybe a copy?
I'm not going to share this right now because it is very much rough, and Katarina's narrative is not written in a language. I have not translated it. But hopefully I will.
This talk will be available.
This talk will be available, and hopefully I will sort of publish this at some point, not too far down the road.
This is a classic Lois McMillan class out there in Oregon. She's a teacher we know well. Hello, Lois, and thanks for bringing your kids again.
Another question from Catherine Roach. In terms of your discussion of art responses, are you familiar with Hiram Powers's The Greek Slave Statue? US, UK abolitionists both adopted and criticized the statue. Any thoughts about this sculpture?
So I am not an art historian, but there are so few images that I can show. And when they asked me to create a PowerPoint, I was trying to make it not just maps. So that's where I am not familiar with that statue. That's another sort of lens, I think, of research would be kind of the cultural production. I've been hesitant to go down that path because I don't want to just make this a project about sort of Western responses or kind of discourses around slavery. I think there's been some really interesting work done on that. But this sounds like a particularly interesting kind of debate. So I should definitely dig that up.
Another question is from Richard Turritz. In what ways do you imagine that a woman being the property of a slave owner and the property of a husband should be seen as similar, and what ways different? If time allows, I'd ask also, how much do we know about the shame manumitted women faced because they may have been raped, prostituted, impregnated while enslaved?
We know very little. All right, as I said, Katarina's story is the only account I have found so far of an actual woman, and it's not an account of her own experience. It's not even clear to me she was ever enslaved. She might have been enslaved. She might have escaped. I don't know her own story. We only know that she is petitioning for money, and that's kind of fascinating to me in its own right. And I think with the question of the property of a slave owner and the property of a husband, I'm trying to be deliberately provocative there. But I think it's one that we have to sort of reflect on in terms of sort of women's place. And there's been some really interesting literature done on the Americas, actually, on the ways that sort of marriage laws change after emancipation, where sort of the marital household of formerly enslaved Black men, right, go and absorb their formerly enslaved wives, right? So they create a subaltern status within sort of the household of emancipated slaves that mirrors that goes on in white or free people's marital formats also. And so I think that this is where it's a little bit, as I said, it's provocative, I think willfully so, to try to think about how do systems of slavery come undone for women in distinct ways. And I think one of the really interesting things about the enslaved Christians is that most of the men who are enslaved get killed, or they get carted off in chains to be on work brigades. It's very rare that we find enslaved men coming back. I do have one case of an enslaved man who's manumitted and he returns to Serbia. But the majority of the people who are living as enslaved peoples are women and their children, some of whom then become men, right? Because they go from boys to men. And so, this idea of the gendered aspect, I think, is something that in this particular case, I'm hoping to tease out and perhaps, connect with larger literatures in places where you have, where there's more of an equal gender split, to see if, we see the same kind of patterns.
So we have sorry, go ahead.
Does slave status pass through the woman? Through the womb, as in Atlantic slavery? As in the children of an enslaved woman, no matter who the father is enslaved?
I don't know.
Because
I don't think so. I think if she has
that's pretty important to Atlantic slavery.
Yeah.
And it's also the way that slavery is undone through gradual abolition laws. So for example, in a place like New York, slavery is abolished, and the slavery is abolished, but the children of enslaved women are bonded to her master until they're like 30 years old. I don't have the exact age at hand, but they're still bonded for a period of time, and then they're free. Right? No one's actually liberated by these gradual abolition laws. Right? But what does happen is the next generation is liberated, because it ends that practice that slave status passes through the womb, regardless of the father.
Yeah.
And is that the case in this world of slavery?
Yeah, so it's definitely the case in like the North Caucasian slave societies that migrate. So you have like these refugees. These are Muslim men with families from the Caucasus who flee Russia, and they have to move someplace else. And the Ottomans move them to different parts, starting out primarily in the Balkans and then later also in the Middle East. And in those societies, it is passed down. It's also passed down in Romani, in systems of racialized Romani enslavement. I don't know about these Christian women. That's a really interesting question. I mean, I know they're enslaved with their children when they're captured together, but should they, have a child
with their
master? I don't. I mean, I don't know. Do you know the answer to that, Laura?
I don't. I mean, I'm struck. I think it probably relates to. I was very struck by your comment about how this is not totally dissimilar to bride theft and kidnapping, and that actually, I mean, it could explain some of the absence of documentation or kind of the apparent comfort with allowing these slave families to, these slaves to continue to exist within the household. That these structures are present outside of these systems of enslavement as well, right? They reflect the nature of marriage, the nature of legal belonging to a household. That might kind of explain why you have this silence about this, because it looks, it's not all that different from what is happening kind of on a more regular basis in many of these places in terms of how people acquire wives, right?
Right.
So I don't know, which is to say, I wouldn't be surprised if it is also essentially the same, but I don't know that for sure.
Yeah. I mean, we have such fascinating cases of kidnapping. Like I have one where someone kidnaps this guy's son, sends his mother, like grandma's going out with a bell and a horse. Like you have these images to try to get the kid back. And I'm thinking, why is grandma going on this with his bell and his horse, right? Is this some part of the negotiation strategy? Is this something who sends their elderly mother on a horse with a bell to try to get back their kid from the kidnapper? I don't know yet, right? But I think it does speak to something about the ways that local societies and sort of the taking of people, both for marriage, but also to absorb children, is going into it. And it's happening on all sides. And this is where I think it's so important to sort of push back against the narrative of, evil, barbaric Ottoman Muslims, right, are claiming, I mean, Christian families are also kidnapping, right? They are also kidnapping Muslim children and Muslim women. And so it's this multi-directional.
Another question or are we done?
Are we done?
There's a few more questions. I guess we have time for one more. Did the Eastern Orthodox Church serve as advocates for the enslaved Christian women? Could freed women seek sanctuary in convents or nunneries if they were considered damaged goods among the civilians?
So I have not come across any evidence of monasteries or churches providing anything more than permission to beg, which they do quite broadly, and sort of clothing and food. But not housing. So that is what I have come with so far. I mean, I think part of the challenge is many of these monasteries might have also been complicit in these systems, and I don't know what exactly we do with that. But in terms of, they definitely give people permission to beg for, to request alms, right? Which is a sort of longer early modern tradition that existed also in Jewish communities, right? Where you can sort of raise money to try to buy back people from slavery. But in terms of, providing more structural support, I have not come across any evidence of that so far.
Well, we've saved all the questions, so for the ones we haven't gotten to, we apologize, but we can share them with Professor Greble, and she may be able to get back to you.
Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. This was really
Thank you, Emily.
session. Thank you.